You are holding one of humanity's strangest inventions right now, paper. It looks worthless. It tears, it burns, it gets wet. And yet this fragile sheet helped humans preserve ideas for thousands of years. But here's the strange part. The man most people believe invented paper probably didn't invent it. So who did? Almost everything you've heard about who invented paper is wrong. For centuries, history credited a Chinese court official named Cai Lun with inventing paper around AD 105. But archaeologists found paper-like materials in China that existed before him. So Cai Lun didn't simply invent paper. He improved an existing technology. But then, who made the first paper? And how did that forgotten invention travel across the world? Imagine having an idea and knowing that when you die, the idea might die with you. For most of human history, that was the problem. Humans could speak, they could remember, they could tell stories. But eventually, the person disappeared. Then humans discovered something extraordinary. They could turn fibers into a sheet, and a sheet into memory. But paper wasn't invented in one moment. It evolved across thousands of years. You've probably heard that paper was invented in China around the year 105 AD by a man named Cai Lun. It's one of those historical facts that sounds perfectly complete. One man, one invention, one date. Except archaeology has a problem with that story. Paper-like materials existed in China before Cai Lun. Historian Sun Suincian documented the long development of Chinese papermaking in his landmark 1985 study Paper and Printing, while archaeological discoveries have provided evidence for paper-like materials from the Western Han period. So Cai Lun probably wasn't standing there one morning inventing paper from nothing. His importance is different. According to the historical record preserved in the Hohanshu, Cai Lun presented an improved papermaking process to the Eastern Han court in AD 105. And the materials associated with that process are fascinating. Bark, hemp, old rags, fishing nets. In other words, things that were already lying around. Things that could be thrown away. Things that looked almost worthless. And somehow, humans learned to turn them into a surface capable of carrying an idea. But before Cai Lun, before China, before paper, humans had another problem. Where do you put a thought? Imagine you're standing in southern Mesopotamia more than 5,000 years ago. There are no notebooks, no printers, no bookshelves filled with paper, no phone in your pocket. But civilization is already becoming complicated. People are storing grain, trading goods, paying workers, managing animals, collecting taxes, and eventually someone needs to remember all of it. So they reach for something incredibly ordinary: mud, wet clay. Around the late 4th millennium BC, people in southern Mesopotamia began pressing reed tools into clay to create marks that developed into cuneiform writing. This isn't speculation. Archaeological evidence from sites including Uruk provides direct evidence for some of the earliest known writing systems. The work of Hans J. Nissen, Peter Damerow, and Robert England in Archaic Bookkeeping, published in 1993, shows how these early writing systems were deeply connected to administration and economic record-keeping. In other words, one of the first great uses of writing wasn't poetry. It was paperwork, ancient paperwork, a civilization trying to remember who owned what. And clay was brilliant for this. You could shape it, you could mark it, you could dry it, and the record could survive for thousands of years. In fact, sometimes disaster made the record even harder to destroy. When ancient buildings burned, some clay tablets were baked. The fire that destroyed a building could help preserve the information inside it, but clay had one enormous weakness: weight. Imagine a library containing thousands of clay tablets. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh contained a huge collection of cuneiform tablets and fragments, commonly estimated at more than 30,000 pieces. That's an enormous amount of information. But try carrying a library like that. You can't. You can store knowledge, but you can't easily move it. And that distinction matters, because eventually humans wanted information to travel. They needed something lighter, something easier to roll, something easier to carry, something that didn't require every important message to be carved into a brick of mud. And Egypt had an answer: papyrus. Along the Nile grew Cyperus papyrus, a tall plant that became one of the most important writing materials in ancient Egypt. The inner pith could be cut into strips, arranged into layers, pressed, and dried. The result was a lightweight writing surface. Letters could travel, administrative records could travel, literature could travel, ideas could travel. Papyrus was a huge step forward, but it still wasn't paper. And this distinction is important. Humans had already discovered that plants could become writing surfaces. The deeper breakthrough was learning how to separate fibers and reform them into a new sheet. Instead of taking a plant and using its natural structure, you break that structure apart. You process the fibers. You suspend them in water. You collect them into a thin layer. You remove the water, and when the fibers dry together, you have a sheet. That basic principle is the foundation of papermaking, and somewhere in ancient China, humans discovered it. But they already had another problem. Writing was not new in China. The Chinese had other materials: bamboo, wooden slips, silk. Cuen Xuanqian's research on Chinese writing materials, particularly written on bamboo and silk, documents how these materials were used before paper became dominant. And each material had a problem. Bamboo was useful, but heavy and bulky. Silk was light, but expensive. So imagine the problem from the perspective of an ancient Chinese administrator. You want something lightweight, you want something flexible, you want something that can be stored, you want something you can write on, but you don't want to spend a fortune. That is the technological gap paper eventually filled. And this is where the story gets interesting, because paper didn't require a magical new ingredient. It required a new way of treating old ingredients: fiber, water, pressure, drying, time. The materials were ordinary. The process was extraordinary. And by the Eastern Han period, papermaking had become important enough that Cai Lun's contribution was recorded by the court historian. The Ho Han Shu describes Cai Lun presenting a papermaking process in AD 105. The traditional story later turned him into the inventor of paper, but archaeology tells us to be more careful. He was not necessarily the first person to produce a sheet from plant fibers. Instead, he appears to have improved and promoted a process that was already developing. And honestly, that makes the story more interesting, because the real invention of paper wasn't one moment. It was a chain. Someone experimented with fibers. Someone discovered that water helped separate them. Someone figured out how to form a sheet. Someone improved the drying process. Someone found better raw materials. Someone made the process practical. And eventually, someone like Cai Lun helped turn an evolving craft into a recognized technology. That's how most human inventions happen. Not with one lightning bolt of genius, but with thousands of small discoveries that eventually become invisible. And once paper became practical, something changed. Information no longer had to be attached to a heavy object. A thought could become portable. A message could become light. A record could be copied. A document could be stored. A book could eventually be assembled from hundreds of pages. And suddenly, memory had a physical form that could travel. But there was still a problem. Paper had been developed in China. So how did the rest of the world get it? How did a technology developed from fibers and water travel thousands of kilometers across mountains, deserts, and empires? And did that famous story about Chinese papermakers being captured at the Battle of Talas really explain it? That's where the story gets much stranger. Before we go there, think about the piece of paper you're holding. If you had lived before paper, what would you have written down first? Your name? A letter? A warning? A story? Or something as ordinary as how much grain you owned? You have paper now, a cheap sheet, something you can fold into your pocket, something you can write on and carry across a country without even thinking about it. But imagine the moment when that wasn't true. Imagine paper existed, but only in another part of the world. You know the technology exists, you know it works, but you don't know how to make it. And between you and the people who know how to make it are mountains, deserts, languages, kingdoms, and thousands of kilometers of land. This is where the story of paper becomes something much bigger. Because inventing a technology is one thing. Getting that technology to cross a continent is another. And the most famous story about how paper traveled west begins with a battle, the Battle of Talas. In AD 751, forces of the Tang dynasty and the Abbasid Caliphate fought near the Talas River in Central Asia. The battle itself is well documented. But then the story becomes controversial. A traditional account says Chinese papermakers were captured after the battle. They were taken west. And eventually they taught people in the Islamic world how to make paper. It sounds perfect. Almost too perfect. China has the technology. The Arabs capture the craftsmen. The secret escapes. Paper spreads. But historians have warned us not to make the story that simple. Jonathan Bloom, in his 2001 book Paper Before Print, examined the history of paper in the Islamic world and emphasized that the transmission of papermaking was a much more complicated process than one battle and a handful of prisoners. That doesn't mean Talas was irrelevant. It means we shouldn't confuse a famous story with a proven single cause. Technology rarely travels in a straight line. It moves through merchants, travelers, craftsmen, diplomats, religious communities, trade routes, and sometimes war. So perhaps the better question isn't, Did the Battle of Talas bring paper to the Islamic world? The better question is, how did papermaking knowledge gradually move across Asia? And this is where geography becomes important. Look at Central Asia on a map. It sits between major civilizations: China to the east, Persia and the Islamic world to the west, trade routes connecting them, caravans moving goods across enormous distances, silk, spices, metals, textiles, ideas, languages, technologies. Paper was one more thing capable of moving along those networks. And once papermaking reached the Islamic world, something happened that changed its importance. Paper found a civilization that had an enormous appetite for written information: the Abbasid Caliphate, and especially Baghdad. By the late 8th and 9th centuries, Baghdad had become one of the great intellectual and administrative centers of the Islamic world, and paper was perfectly suited to that environment, because paper wasn't only useful for books, it was useful for bureaucracy. Letters, contracts, accounts, government records, scholarly manuscripts, copies of texts. And this is where paper starts becoming more than a material. It becomes infrastructure. Think about a government. A government needs memory. Who paid taxes? How much grain was collected? Which official was responsible for a province? What did the ruler order? Which merchant owes money? Without written records, much of that information has to live inside human memory. And human memory is fragile. People forget. People die. People disagree. Paper gives institutions another option: put the information somewhere else, store it, copy it, send it, retrieve it. This is one reason historians consider the spread of paper so important. Not because paper magically created scholarship, it didn't. The Islamic world already possessed sophisticated traditions of scholarship, administration, literature, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and law. Paper helped make the physical production and circulation of written material easier, and that distinction matters. Paper didn't create intelligence. It lowered some of the material barriers to preserving and moving intelligence. Now imagine you're a scholar in Baghdad. Someone has a text you want to read. Before cheap writing materials become widely available, every copy is expensive. Someone has to reproduce it by hand, page after page, word after word. But when paper becomes increasingly available, the economics begin to change. Copies become easier, documents become easier, archives become larger. Books can circulate more widely, knowledge can travel farther, and suddenly the city becomes filled with something incredibly powerful: written memory. But the story doesn't stop in Baghdad. Paper keeps moving across North Africa, across the Mediterranean, into Islamic Spain, and eventually into Europe. Jonathan Bloom's Paper Before Print, published in 2001, is one of the major scholarly works tracing this Western history of paper. And one of the important things the historical record shows is that paper did not instantly replace every older writing material. That would be too simple. Parchment continued to be used. Papyrus continued to exist in regions where it was available. Different societies use different materials for different purposes. Technology doesn't usually arrive and immediately destroy what came before. Instead, the old and the new overlap. People compare them, adapt them, choose between them, and gradually, one becomes more useful for certain tasks. Paper had one enormous advantage: it could be produced from fibers, and fibers were available in many places. The exact materials and techniques could change, but the underlying principle could travel. Take fiber, process it, turn it into pulp, form a sheet, dry it, repeat. The technology could adapt to local conditions. And that is one of the reasons inventions survive. They don't have to remain exactly the way they were invented. They have to be adaptable. And eventually, Europe began developing its own paper-making centers. One important early center was Zativa in Islamic Spain. Then, during the later medieval period, Italian paper producers became increasingly important. And this is where another strange transformation begins. Because Europe already had books. Europe already had writing. Europe already had universities. Europe already had libraries. So why did paper matter so much? Because a book isn't just information, it's a physical object, and the cost of that physical object determines how many copies can exist. For centuries, parchment was an extremely important European writing material. It was durable. It could last a very long time under good conditions, but parchment required animal skins, and preparing those skins took labor. Paper offered another material pathway, and eventually, the two existed side by side. Then came printing, and this is where the story accelerates. Because printing wasn't invented in Europe. Woodblock printing had existed in East Asia for centuries. One of the most famous surviving examples is the Diamond Sutra, produced in China in AD 868. The date is significant because it demonstrates something important. Long before Gutenberg, Chinese printers were already producing complete printed texts. The history of printing is therefore much older and more geographically complicated than the familiar European story suggests. But then, in 15th century Europe, Johannes Gutenberg developed a highly effective printing system based on movable metal type, a press, ink, and a production process capable of making many copies. And paper was waiting for it. This is where two technologies collide. Printing makes copies faster. Paper makes the physical pages practical. Together, they create an information explosion. Not instantly, not magically, but over generations. And this is one of the strongest conclusions supported by historians of printing. Elizabeth Eisenstein's 1979 study, The Printing Press as an Agent of Change, examined how printing transformed the production and circulation of texts in Europe. But here's something important. Printing didn't simply create more books. It changed the relationship between a person and information. Before mass printing, a text could be rare. A scholar might know that a book existed without ever seeing it. After printing expands production, the same text can exist in many places at once. One copy can become hundreds. Hundreds can become thousands. And suddenly, an idea doesn't have to remain where it was born. It can travel. This is where paper becomes something much more powerful than a writing surface. It becomes an amplifier. A thought begins in one person's mind. Someone writes it down. A printer reproduces it. A merchant carries it. A student reads it. Another writer responds. Another printer copies that response. And now the original thought has entered a network. That is how information begins behaving differently. And this is where we need to stop thinking about paper as a piece of stationery. Paper is becoming a transportation system for ideas. But there is still a problem. All of this requires enormous amounts of paper. More books, more schools, more governments, more merchants, more letters, more newspapers, more readers. The demand keeps growing. And suddenly, the old sources of fiber aren't enough. For centuries, European papermakers relied heavily on discarded textiles, such as linen and hemp rags. Recycling old material wasn't some modern environmental invention. It was practical. If you needed fibers, and an old shirt contained good fibers, you didn't throw the shirt away. You turned it into paper. But eventually, industrial society needed paper on a scale that rag collection could not easily support. And then humans looked towards something much bigger. Forests, wood. This sounds obvious now, but wood is not paper. You can't simply cut down a tree, put it through a machine, and pull out a notebook. Wood contains fibers embedded in a complex structure. The challenge was separating those fibers efficiently. And during the 19th century, new mechanical and chemical pulping technologies began transforming the industry. One important figure was Friedrich Gottlob Keller. In the 1840s, Keller developed a mechanical process for producing pulp from wood. His work was patented in 1845. Historical accounts of papermaking, including Dard Hunter's 1978 Papermaking, place Keller among the important figures in the transition toward industrial wood pulp paper. Around the same period, Charles Fenerty in Nova Scotia independently experimented with producing paper from wood pulp. And again, notice the pattern. There isn't one genius. There isn't one perfect moment. There are multiple people solving the same problem from different directions. That is how technology actually evolves. China develops papermaking. Central Asia helps carry the technology west. The Islamic world adapts it. Europe develops its own production centers. Printing increases demand. Industrial technology finds new sources of fiber. And eventually, paper becomes cheap. Really cheap. Cheap enough that you stop thinking about it. And that is when a technology has truly conquered everyday life. When you no longer notice it. You don't wake up and think, what an incredible achievement that I can write on a sheet of processed plant fiber. You just grab a pen. You write. You throw the paper away. You move on. But think about what just happened. A technology that began thousands of years ago, crossed civilizations, crossed languages, crossed religions, crossed empires, changed materials, changed manufacturing, and eventually ended up under your hand. But the biggest transformation was still ahead. Because once paper became cheap enough, humans didn't just use it to preserve information. They began producing information on a scale previous generations could barely imagine. Newspapers, textbooks, scientific journals, maps, government forms, posters, letters, books, and eventually, almost everything around you. The paper in your room is connected to the same technological story, And here's where the story gets even stranger. The more information humans produced, the less we noticed the material carrying it. Paper became invisible, but the information didn't. It multiplied, it spread, it accumulated, and eventually it helped create the world you're living in right now. So look at that sheet of paper again. A few fibers, a little water, pressure, drying. That's what it looks like. Almost nothing. But somehow, that almost nothing became one of humanity's greatest tools for remembering. And if paper could travel from ancient China across half the world, what happened when humans learned to make information move even faster? That is where the story becomes something completely different. Because paper didn't just help humans remember. It helped humans build a world where one person's idea could reach millions. If you could send one piece of paper back through history to a civilization that had never seen it, where would you send it? Ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Rome, or somewhere else? Tell me in the comments. Look at the paper around you. A book, a receipt, a cardboard box, a handwritten note. Maybe there is a sheet sitting beside your keyboard right now that contains something you wrote yesterday. You probably don't think of it as technology. That's the strange part. Because paper has become so ordinary that we've forgotten what it actually gave us. Not just a surface to write on, a way to move memory outside the human brain. And once humans learned how to do that, the consequences became enormous. Think about your own memory. You remember faces, places, conversations, names, maybe a phone number. But there is a limit. Your brain is not a library. It forgets, it changes. It confuses one memory with another. And when a person dies, much of what they knew can disappear with them. For most of human history, this was simply part of being human. Knowledge had to move from person to person, through speech, through demonstration, through imitation, through stories, through songs, through memory. Writing changed that. And paper made one form of writing dramatically easier to reproduce and transport. This is an important distinction. Paper did not invent human memory. It did not invent knowledge. It did not create civilization by itself, but it gave civilization a new physical way to store and move information. And historians have good evidence for this transformation. From the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, to Egyptian papyri, to Chinese manuscripts, to Islamic libraries, to European printed books, humans increasingly built systems where information could exist outside the person who originally knew it. And that changes something fundamental. Imagine you are a merchant thousands of years ago. You have traded with someone before. You remember the amount. You remember the agreement. But what happens when you die? Your memory dies with you. Now imagine that agreement is written down. Someone else can read it. A generation later, someone else can read it again. The information has become independent of the original person's memory. That's what writing does. Paper makes that process easier to scale. And eventually, something extraordinary happens. The written record stops being just a memory of the past. It becomes a tool for creating the future. A scientist writes down an observation. Another scientist reads it, they disagree, they test it, they write their results, someone else reads those results, they improve the experiment, another person publishes a different conclusion, and suddenly, knowledge is no longer trapped inside individual lifetimes. It accumulates. That idea is one of the most important things to understand about human civilization. Human intelligence is not only what one brain can do, it's what millions of brains can build when information can move between them. Paper became one of the physical systems that helped make that possible. But there is a darker side to this, because paper doesn't only preserve truth, it preserves everything. Truth, mistakes, rumors, propaganda, laws, poetry, scientific discoveries, religious arguments, government orders, personal letters, and sometimes the most boring things imaginable. A receipt, a tax record, a shopping list, a complaint, a contract. And those boring documents can become incredibly valuable thousands of years later. Because history isn't made only by kings. It is made by ordinary people. And sometimes, the ordinary survives. This is one of the reasons written archives are so powerful for historians. A monument tells you what someone wanted to build. A royal inscription tells you what a ruler wanted remembered. But an everyday document can reveal what people actually did. What they bought, what they owed, what they traded, what they argued about, what they needed, what they feared. The ordinary can become evidence, and paper eventually became exceptionally good at preserving the ordinary. But there was another transformation coming: printing. Paper and printing are separate technologies. That's important. Printing existed in East Asia long before Gutenberg. Woodblock printing was used in China for centuries. The Diamond Sutra, produced in AD 868, is one of the earliest known dated printed books. That single object tells us something important. The printing revolution did not begin suddenly in 15th century Europe. Humans had already been experimenting with mechanical reproduction of texts in East Asia for centuries. But in Europe during the 15th century, Johannes Gutenberg developed a highly effective printing system using movable metal type, a press, ink, and a production process capable of reproducing texts at much larger scales than hand copying. And paper was perfectly suited for this new world. Now imagine the difference. One handwritten manuscript versus hundreds of printed copies. One person's words versus an idea that can suddenly appear in hundreds of places. That is not just faster writing. That's a change in the speed of information. Elizabeth Eisenstein's 1979 study, The Printing Press as an Agent of Change, examined the broader consequences of printing for European intellectual and cultural life. Her work helped establish an important historical argument. Printing didn't simply produce more books, it changed the conditions under which information could be reproduced, circulated, compared, and preserved. But again, paper did not cause everything. Printing wasn't a magic machine that suddenly created modern science. The transformation came from several technologies and institutions interacting. Paper, printing, education, trade, universities, governments, religious institutions, urban centers, and people who wanted information. Technology creates possibilities. Humans decide what to do with them. And once paper and printing became deeply integrated, information began moving at a scale that earlier civilizations could barely have imagined. A scientific idea could be printed, a political argument could be printed, a religious criticism could be printed, a map could be copied, a newspaper could reach thousands of people. And suddenly, geography became less powerful as a barrier to information. An idea born in one city could be discussed in another, then another, then another. The paper itself was still just fibers, but the network built around it was becoming enormous. And then came another transformation, industrialization. Remember the problem. Humans wanted more paper, more books, more newspapers, more schools, more records, more readers, but old textile rags could only supply so much fiber. So during the 19th century, paper makers increasingly turned toward wood. Wood was abundant, but wood isn't paper. The useful material is the fiber. And extracting those fibers efficiently became one of the major challenges of industrial papermaking. Friedrich Gottlob Keller developed an important mechanical wood pulp process in the 1840s and received a patent in 1845. Around the same period, Charles Fenerty in Nova Scotia independently experimented with producing paper from wood pulp. Historical studies of papermaking, including Dardhunter's 1978 Papermaking, document this transition toward industrial wood pulp production. And once industrial production began scaling, paper changed again. It became cheap enough for ordinary people. Newspapers became possible on a huge scale. School books became more accessible. Government paperwork expanded. Commercial records multiplied. Letters traveled. Advertising expanded. Packaging exploded. Paper stopped being something associated mainly with scribes and scholars. It became part of everyday life. And that may be the greatest measure of technological success. You stop noticing the invention. Think about electricity. You don't stare at the wall every time you turn on a light. Think about metal. You don't think about metallurgy every time you open a door. And you don't think about thousands of years of paper making every time you write a grocery list. The technology disappears. The effect remains. But here's where the story gets really strange. If you could preserve one memory from your own life on a piece of paper and send it 1,000 years into the future, what would you write? Put it in the comments. Not a fact, not a quote. Just one memory you would want someone 1,000 years from now to know existed. And if this story changed the way you look at something as ordinary as paper, subscribe to Forgotten Ancestors. Because there are thousands of ordinary objects around you right now, and almost every one of them has a story. Next time, we're going even further back, to something you probably touched before you even left your bed this morning, and asking how humans survived before it existed. Because the strangest part of human history isn't that we invented incredible things. It's that the greatest inventions eventually become invisible. You stop seeing them. You stop questioning them. You simply use them. And sometimes,